Luke Skywalker succeeded as a protagonist because he entered the story without predetermined significance. A New Hope introduced him as a local farmhand with routine frustrations, stagnant ambitions, and no meaningful influence on the galaxy. His lack of special status grounded the narrative in a way that later films struggled to replicate. Luke was not framed as extraordinary. He was framed as available to possibility, which made the audience view his journey as achievable rather than predetermined. His early scenes established a character defined by inexperience rather than superiority. He complains, hesitates, and falters, revealing a person shaped by isolation more than training. The film relied on scale, not lineage, to create meaning. Luke was small because the world was large, not because he was destined to rise above it. This contrast made his introduction to rebellion feel natural instead of mythic. He stepped into conflict because circumstances pushed him, not because destiny summoned him. Luke's relationships reinforced his ordinariness. Owen and Beru treat him like any restless teenager, not a figure of importance. Han views him as naive. Leia sees him as a new recruit. A New Hope built credibility by allowing every character to respond to Luke with grounded social realism. He was not a chosen heir or hidden prodigy. He was an inexperienced participant, learning alongside the audience, creating a shared sense of discovery. The film's presentation of the Force further supported Luke's relatability. The Force was not depicted as genetics, prophecy, or rare inheritance. It functioned as an intuitive discipline, accessible to anyone willing to trust instinct over control. Obi-Wan's instructions did not emphasize talent, they emphasized willingness. When Luke uses the Force during training, the scene positions him not as a prodigy, but as a student who pays attention. Nothing about his growth suggests elite status. Luke's absence of legacy strengthened the film's thematic structure. Because he came from nowhere, the galaxy felt authentically vast. His life on Tatooine symbolized the countless unseen citizens living outside major institutions. When he joined the rebellion, the story implied that revolution depends on ordinary people choosing to participate. This structural approach elevated the stakes without resorting to mythological framing or predestined heroism. A New Hope grounded its stakes through Luke's limitations. He missed shots, misread situations, and misinterpreted danger. His failures made progress feel legitimate because the film respected the learning curve required for growth. When he engaged stormtroopers, his lack of combat experience was clear. When he attempted diplomacy, his lack of authority was clear. These realistic constraints kept the narrative relatable and prevented Luke from becoming an idealized figure. Luke's curiosity functioned as his primary asset. Instead of prophecy, the film emphasized learning, experimentation, and adaptation. He understood droids quickly because he worked with machines. He could fly because he trained with small craft. A New Hope built his competence from practical experience rather than mystical advantage. The movie reinforced the value of ordinary skills, applied at the right time instead of mythic abilities granted by fate. His motivation aligned with universal audience experience. He did not seek glory or power. He sought purpose. The binary sunset scene encapsulated this desire, not through destiny but through longing. It communicated the experience of feeling trapped in circumstances too small for one's aspirations. The moment resonated not because Luke was chosen, but because he wanted something more without knowing what that more would become. Luke's introduction to the rebellion reflected realistic progression. He was assigned duties rather than honoured roles. He became a pilot because he could fly, not because anyone thought he would change history. He succeeded during the Death Star assault because he applied existing skills to a new challenge. The film rewarded preparation rather than pedigree, which reinforced the legitimacy of his achievement. The Death Star trench run worked narratively because Luke's success was improbable, not inevitable. The sequence highlights his fear, confusion, and lack of confidence. His final decision to trust the Force was not framed as destiny but as risk. The story allowed him to hesitate and even doubt the instruction. When he turned off his targeting computer, the moment felt tense because the film never implied he was guaranteed to succeed. A New Hope emphasized community over lineage. Luke did not rise because of bloodline advantage. He succeeded because others guided him, supported him, and challenged him. Han's last-minute intervention mattered because Luke could not survive alone. Obi-Wan's voice provided guidance, not empowerment. The rebellion's structure provided purpose. Luke's identity formed through participation, not inheritance. The absence of family revelations strengthened Luke's arc. Without knowledge of his lineage, he approached the Force with humility. He practiced because he believed, not because he felt entitled. The film treated every step of his journey as self-generated. This autonomy allowed the Force to function as a metaphor for trust rather than a mechanism for inherited superiority. Luke's ordinariness protected the film from narrative over-engineering. His role did not require mythological setup or multi-film foreshadowing. The story built itself around simple concepts: a person finding courage, a rebellion finding hope, and a galaxy finding a reason to resist. Because Luke had no guaranteed trajectory, every development carried authentic uncertainty. A New Hope succeeded because Luke's story reflected possibility rather than prophecy. He began as a viewer surrogate navigating a world larger than himself. His transformation was meaningful precisely because nothing about him suggested greatness. He proved that impact emerged from action, not ancestry. His ordinariness was not a limitation. It was the structural element that made Star Wars believable. Luke's anonymity reshaped how audiences interpreted the Force by presenting it as a universal principle rather than an exclusive heritage. Because he approached it without legacy, the idea remained accessible to viewers. The Force behaved like a discipline grounded in trust, patience, and intuition. This portrayal allowed the early films to build spiritual depth without creating barriers to participation. In A New Hope, the Force belonged to anyone willing to seek it. The film positioned heroism as circumstantial rather than predetermined. Luke entered the rebellion not because he was destined to, but because events unfolded in a way that required someone to act. The story's foundation rested on responsiveness, not fate. This structure allowed Star Wars to function as an ensemble narrative, where contributions mattered regardless of origin. Luke's background prevented the story from becoming a myth about bloodline superiority. His anonymity created a model for narrative scale. The galaxy felt larger because Luke lacked significance. Every new location, culture, and character expanded his understanding alongside the audience's. Later films introduced protagonists with predetermined roles, which compressed the narrative scope. A New Hope grew outward from Luke's limited worldview, giving the franchise its initial sense of exploration. The story framed achievement as the result of personal decisions, not inherited potential. Luke's breakthrough moments, trusting the Force, joining the rebellion, piloting the X-Wing, were choices, not obligations. Because he was not expected to become a hero, his evolution represented commitment rather than compliance. That distinction created a narrative environment where success felt earned. A New Hope demonstrated the power of minimalism in world-building. It did not rely on elaborate lore to justify Luke's importance. The film withheld explanations for the Force, the rebellion's origins, or the galaxy's deeper history. Luke's lack of knowledge justified this restraint. The audience did not need exposition because the protagonist did not possess it. This approach created clarity that later entries struggled to maintain. Luke's anonymity also strengthened the rebellion's ideological message. The movement was not built around a central figure but around shared values. Luke's role as an ordinary recruit reinforced the democratic structure of the resistance effort. His contribution mattered because the rebellion valued action over identity. This theme became diluted in later films when heroes were framed as symbolically significant rather than practically involved. The success of the Death Star mission relied on a collective effort that contextualized Luke's role without elevating him above others. He was one pilot among many, following instructions, receiving cover fire, and benefiting from teamwork. His victory highlighted capability rather than destiny. A New Hope used this structure to show that monumental achievements require collaboration, not prophecy. Luke's ordinary origins allowed future films to escalate his character without undermining the initial premise. Because he began with no inherent importance, his transformation into a Jedi carried narrative weight. His later significance impacted the galaxy precisely because it emerged from growth rather than birth. When later stories reframed him through lineage, they retroactively altered the meaning of his victory, shifting from earned progression to inherited fate. A New Hope succeeded because it presented the Force as an internal alignment rather than an external advantage. Luke connected with it because he listened, not because he possessed unique genetic attributes. The film implied that the Force responds to intention and clarity rather than pedigree. This interpretation maintained thematic equity across characters and upheld the idea that belief can influence outcomes. Luke's anonymity allowed Star Wars to balance myth and realism. The film introduced archetypal symbols, knights, princesses, villains, but grounded them through Luke's perspective. His lack of status made myth feel reachable. The grand elements of the story did not overshadow the human experience because the protagonist was not elevated above the audience emotionally or socially. The narrative's reliance on chance encounters reinforced the authenticity of Luke's journey. He met Obi-Wan because he happened to buy the right droids. He joined the rebellion because circumstances collapsed around him. These elements emphasized the randomness of history rather than the guidance of fate. Luke's path emerged organically, not according to a predetermined timeline. Luke's ordinariness allowed A New Hope to establish a flexible foundation for the franchise. Future films could explore Force mysticism, political corruption, and galactic philosophy precisely because the first entry maintained simplicity. Luke functioned as a neutral anchor, a character whose lack of predetermined meaning allowed the universe around him to expand without contradiction. A New Hope remained structurally distinct because it built heroism from absence rather than expectation. Luke became important through action, not ancestry. He shaped the galaxy by participating, not by fulfilling prophecy. The film's thematic strength derives from the idea that influence arises when individuals step forward during moments of crisis, not when destiny selects them. Luke's anonymity cemented the film's enduring appeal. It preserved the idea that heroism is not inherited, but chosen. It demonstrated that a narrative can achieve mythic significance without relying on predestination. A New Hope succeeded because it respected the relationship between scale and simplicity. It introduced a galaxy defined by possibility, and it used a nobody to prove that possibility mattered.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.